28. What do you do when a child who bleeds and sweats and pees LSD suddenly goes missing? We conducted a massive search, as massive as we could manage. Almost every mentally elevated CIA department was involved. We didn't trust anybody else. We never trusted anybody else. Shit, we couldn't even trust ourselves, considering that was one of our own who had taken the child. We searched for about 2 months, but never really turned up any leads. Since every other returned child had died within a few days of being freed from their amniotic sac, we scaled the search down pretty quickly. It was one thing to search for somebody like Bin Laden, when everybody knows you're looking for him. It's another thing to search for somebody you had just worked quite hard to erase from official existence, so you would be free to perform tests on her. We felt that the search itself was more of a security risk than the missing child, since she was almost certainly dead. There was also a feeling that maybe it was for the best. Maybe she would survive. Maybe she would have a happy life. Maybe it was best not to know her fate. But then, about 7 years later, we learned what happened. If you'll allow me to wax philosophical for a moment, I'd like to quote a poem by Aeschylus that I've never actually read. Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until, in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. While I'm no literary scholar, I believe this means learning can hurt sometimes. So she had survived. Her genes came up in our program to collect a global genetic snapshot, a total boondoggle, by the way. So where was she? In some Russian laboratory? Living out in the jungle, being worshipped as a god by some doomsday cult like Johnny Hutu? Floating through space in a bubble to Jupiter and beyond? Estonia. She was found in Estonia, in a Swedish-speaking village on the island of Hiluma. She was living a normal life. Apparently the issue with the bio-LSD had resolved itself after detachment from the placenta. Otherwise, anybody who got a kiss from her would have found themselves going on a very strange journey. She was about 13 years old at this point, and had survived travel far longer than any other child. This meant she was an asset we absolutely had to obtain. She contained the secret to survivable travel, something that had eluded us for years. It would have been convenient if she was living a life of abuse and drudgery in some orphanage somewhere. We could have simply considered her a victim of fortune. But she was actually living in a quaint little village on the edge of a beautiful forest with an old couple who had been given some phony story by our former agent. It was a nice life. Quiet. Maybe a little boring, but a nice one. We took her in the middle of the night back to our facility in Colorado. In the end, she wasn't a victim of fortune. She was a victim of us. 29. That's interesting. When I was working for the CIA, we found that animals could often survive travel through the flesh interfaces better than humans could. We regularly had success sending dogs and cats through. Somebody hit upon the idea of sending some Gracula religiosa, hill mina, through the interface because they're adept at imitating sounds. This was the next best thing to sending a tape recorder. The interfaces did not accept non-living objects. We worked on grafting a tape recorder to a turtle, but this was unsuccessful on several levels. We sent the birds through, and they returned unencased, but covered with the typical fluids. Those of us who subscribed to the alien theory had high hopes that they would record alien speech. Instead, or indeed, they came back imitating a strange flute-like speech music. The music was quite interesting, though having all the birds sing at once created distinctly unpleasant effect. Somebody in the department ended up killing all the birds, though we never found out who. 30. After the orbital arrays incinerated the city, they dropped our platoon in to take a look around. We had seen it before, an endless graveyard, everything ashes, ash buildings, ash people. For 6 days we trudged through the dead city before finding the first sign of life. On the edge of the blast zone, before frozen winter fields, a small flowering bush. Perhaps the heat of the bombardment had tricked it into blooming early. We all looked at it for a silent moment and quickly moved on. We were young and tired and just miles from the rendezvous. Yet sometimes at night that silent moment returns, and I see them fluttering again, in the cold, uncaring wind. Doomed flowers, soft and pale. Terraform. I'm not sure who came up with the idea of sending a dead body through the portal. It's such a simple idea, and yet, at the time, it made no more sense than buckling a dead body into a space capsule and sending it up into space. We wanted to find out what was on the other side of the portal, beyond the event horizon. We had been studying the so-called flesh interfaces for years, and of all the mysteries that surrounded them, the portal phenomenon, the apparent teleportation of objects which occurred within the fleshly tunnel, was the greatest mystery of all. So sending a dead body made little sense. Remember, this is what we knew at the time. Point 1. If an inanimate object went into the portal, it returned a short time, less than 3 seconds, later at a random location within the interior zone. Cameras and sensors picked up nothing of interest. Point 2. If an animal went into the portal, it sometimes returned, either alive or dead. Most returned altered. Point 3. If an adult human went into the portal, the person was likely to return, but would either be dead or too altered to describe the other side. Those who returned alive died shortly after. Point 4. If a child went into the portal, the child was likely to return alive, but was invariably altered. However, the altering was relatively mild, and some even remained cognizant. Unfortunately, information gleaned from them was cryptic, and seemed to generate more questions than answers. They all died shortly after. Sending children through the portal was distasteful to us for obvious reasons, and we were searching for an alternative. One day, during an experiment, somebody was about to send a group of genetically altered mice through when they noticed that one of the mice was dead. Perhaps out of curiosity, they sent it with the others anyways. All the mice came back alive. This was obviously of great interest. Now we were not only dealing with teleportation, but with resurrection. Of course, we immediately started sending all manner of dead animals through the portal. We joked that if the portal was actually some kind of alien office mailing tube, they'd probably be pretty pissed about all the dead rodents. Most of the animals were rejected in the manner of inanimate objects, but occasionally, if they were quite freshly dead, they would come back alive. Not only that, but none of the returned animals seemed altered at all. This was exciting. Naturally, we progressed to people. We wanted very fresh, very intact corpses, so we had to face the question of how to kill a person with the least harm, as the official recommendations absurdly phrased it. We settled on a method of stopping the heart with electricity. Very neat. The first 16 subjects were rejected by the portal. We felt pretty low. In our attempts at resurrection, we were racking up quite a body count. Finally, the 17th subject came back to us. Not only that, but he was cognizant, and seemed entirely unaltered. Now, finally, after decades, we were about to find out the secret of the other side. In 63 BC, the Roman general Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus marched his soldiers across the kingdom of Judea and laid siege to Jerusalem, its heavily fortified capital city. Known to history as Pompey the Great, he was 43 years old at the time and one of the most powerful men in the world, an ascendant general tasked with expanding the mightiest empire on earth. In his dealings with the occupants of the obscure kingdom of Judea, he surely had become aware of their peculiar devotion to a mysterious god which they worshipped to the exclusion of all others. A strange notion for a cosmopolitan Roman, accustomed to a bustling marketplace of competing gods and cults. He also knew that at the heart of Jerusalem there stood a great temple, even more well fortified than the rest of the city, where this curious god resided amongst angelic statues of gold and other symbols of occult majesty. This temple was the holiest site in a holy kingdom, and contained within its walls a small sanctuary chamber, known as the Kodesh HaKodeshim, or Holy of Holies, where the very presence of this god was said to dwell in the darkness. Nobody in the kingdom was allowed into the Kodesh HaKodeshim, except the high priest, and then only once a year on the Day of Atonement, to sprinkle animal blood on the ground as an offering. The Kodesh HaKodeshim was separated from the rest of the temple by an elaborate curtain, and the high priest was required to ritually cleanse himself before entering. It was said that any unclean person who entered the Kodesh HaKodeshim would be met with death, and legend has it that the high priest only entered the sanctuary with a rope tied around his ankle, so that if he died therein, he could be pulled back out. How much of this did Pompey the Great know on the day the city finally fell after a 3-month siege? On that day, he and his soldiers slaughtered 12,000 Jews who were defending the sanctuary, and he strode through the entrance of the imposing temple as a conquering hero to the Romans, and a murdering intruder to the Jews. Inside the temple, he saw the glittering wealth acquired from faithful Jews throughout the region. But rather than wealth, it seemed that he was more interested in finally laying eyes on the reclusive God he had heard so much about. Ancient historians record that he did not relieve the temple of its treasure, but instead went to the Kodesh HaKodeshim. Maybe he wanted to see what sort of magical creature could maintain such a peculiar hold over its faithful that they would not abandon the temple even after it was hopelessly overrun, that they would stay and die by the thousands, sacrificing their own blood on its grounds. Perhaps he was unaware of the tales of death that surrounded the Kodesh HaKodeshim. Perhaps he didn't know that this was a god which had leveled the world with a flood, which had rained fire on cities, which had delivered the Jews from the yoke of the mighty Egyptian Empire, which had destroyed armies and kingdoms. Or perhaps he had heard these stories and simply didn't believe them. At any rate, history records that he went to the inner part of the temple and pulled back the curtain which hid the Kodesh HaKodeshim from the world, so that he might stand and gaze upon the very presence of God. The man was an illegal immigrant from Honduras. Illegal immigration had always been a great help to us. Why bother to erase people when they can do it themselves? Anyways, he was under the impression that he had been in the custody of immigration enforcement for the last few months, while we ran the standard battery of tests. He was 24 years old, 171 centimeters tall, above average intelligence. We stopped his heart with electrodes and put him inside the flesh interface. He came back quite jittery and minimally responsive. Posing as doctors and nurses, our technicians took him to a medical room for testing and interviews. We assumed he had been altered, but we tested his blood for the presence of the exotic LSD analogs that accompany alteration, and there were none. Slowly, over a period of several hours, he began to calm down. Then he began to talk. We asked him what he remembered about the last few hours. He was under the impression that his experiences had merely been a dream, that some sort of calamity had happened during his sleep which left him reeling. He assumed that the part where we dragged him out of bed and stopped his heart was a dream too. He said that after that part of the dream, he suddenly found himself inside something that looked like a giant sausage casing, like a tunnel of meat. This was very exciting to us, because it roughly corresponded to the appearance of the flesh interface which contained the portal. But given how he was brought into the interface tunnel, dead, and returned within the interior zone, he couldn't possibly have seen the interface tunnel. Therefore, we surmised, he was describing the interface on the other side of the portal. This was our first concrete knowledge of what was on the other side. What did Pompey expect to find on the other side of the curtain? In many Roman temples there was an image of the honored god occupying some central place in the structure. It can be assumed that he expected to find one of these. But did he expect to find the actual presence of God? Could he have possibly expected this? For if he had believed in the Jewish lore, wouldn't he have also expected death? Wouldn't he expect to be punished for defiling the temple? Would he have been so cavalier about pulling back the curtain? Perhaps in his polytheistic mindset, he assumed that his gods, which had seen fit to give him yet another glorious victory, were more powerful than this backwater Jewish god. What did we expect to find on the other side of the portal? Some kind of intelligence which could explain the bizarre technology of the flesh interfaces? If the interfaces were the product of an intelligence, was it really something we wanted to make contact with? Did we expect this intelligence to be kind and benevolent? If so, how could we have sent so many living creatures, so many people, so many children to their deaths? What would a benevolent intelligence possibly make of our ruthlessness, our rapacious quest for understanding? According to Tacitus, the ancient historian, when Pompey pulled back the curtain and gazed upon the Kodesh HaKodeshim, it contained no representation of the deity, the sanctuary was empty, and the Holy of Holies untenanted. He found nothing, an empty room, nor was he met with death, Instead, he strode out of the temple, alive and healthy, destined to go on to greater and greater political glory, until 15 years later, when he was finally stabbed to death on the shores of the Nile Delta after his defeat to Julius Caesar in the Roman Civil War. As the man spoke of walking through the unearthly living tunnel of the flesh interface, he said he saw a bluish light ahead and heard what seemed to be music, almost like flutes but much, much deeper. As he told his story, sitting on the edge of a hospital bed wearing a loose gown, his hand wandered to his chest, and he touched the skin above his heart. There he found 2 slightly singed patches of skin, where we had attached the electrodes that ended his life. I still get chills when I recall how his face changed when he realized that it had not been a dream at all. It was a pitiful, almost childish look of terrible, unwanted understanding. Tears quickly flooded his eyes. This man, who had been brought back from death itself by an unimaginable technology, by forces beyond all our understanding, slowly went limp and died for a second time. And so we were left with disappointment once again. More mystery, more frustration. We'd already heard from our child subjects about the strange flute music, but always in cryptic, disjointed terms. We had hoped that this man would give us something more concrete, but the answer had eluded us once again. So we went back to our experiments, selecting a new round of subjects to send through the portal. We had already sacrificed so many lives in our quest, and there was no reason to stop then. Knowing what I know now, I sometimes wonder, was Pompey lucky when he pulled back the curtain and found nothing? 31. Of all the children who had been returned from the portals, only one survived in the long term, though we didn't even realize it until years later. She had been stolen, or rescued, from us by a rogue technician shortly after return, and was thus lost to us for many years. We finally found her in Estonia, and kidnapped her from her adoptive family in the middle of the night. She was 7 when we lost her, and 13 when we found her again. We did a preliminary interview, and she seemed normal in every respect. Mind you, this was a girl who entered a massive, possibly alien biological device called a flesh interface, disappeared from existence for several minutes, then returned encased in an amniotic sac, attached to a placenta via umbilical cord, with enough LSD in her bloodstream to turn all of Utah into one massive orgy. Naturally, we expected some sort of mental changes, especially since every child who returned from the portals had showed signs of mental aberration. Then again, every other child had died shortly after return, so she was clearly something special. But no, she was normal. Frustratingly normal. So we started prying into her past. She was reticent, but young and fairly trusting, and it wasn't hard to get information out of her. She said she was born in Brazil, which was correct. We had acquired her from a Brazilian orphanage where she had lived since infancy, the daughter of a dead prostitute and an unknown father. She vaguely remembered her time at the orphanage, and they were not very happy memories. She then began telling us about the first day she met her adoptive parents. But we wanted to know about the time in between, when she was not in our possession, when she went into the portal and came back. We asked what happened before she met her adoptive parents. She said she remembered a long, boring boat trip to come over to the Estonian islands. We asked her where she had lived before then. At this question, she grew distinctly uncomfortable. She said she didn't really remember. We pressed her. Her face began to twitch and shudder. This was the first time she had showed any sign of abnormality. We kept pressing her on the question. "There was one summer," she said quietly, "after I moved out of the orphanage, but before I came to Estonia, when I lived with a woman who said she was my mother." This was news to us. Our files had it that she had lived continuously at the orphanage. We asked her about the exact time, but all she knew was that it was for one summer. This was curious, because she had been in our possession one summer, 7 years ago. The timelines matched well, but the events were entirely different. We asked her to elaborate. She said that one day a woman had come to the orphanage saying that she was her mother, and the Americans who ran the place had made her go with the woman. They had gone to a crummy old house, and she lived there for the summer. As she said this, she began to sob. She said that she had forgotten all about this, that she hardly remembered it at all, that she didn't want to talk about it. She wasn't my mother. I knew. Her face wasn't right. It wasn't a real face. 32. Oh no. This one is real. This is always the first thought when waking up after a blackout. After hours of flitting between different varieties of nightmare, you start to dream that you are lying sick and insane in a stained bed in a shithole apartment that smells like cigarettes and spoiled ham. Your slowly crystallizing consciousness begins to note that this particular nightmare is more persistent than the others, that it has a certain uncanny clarity to it. Oh no, you realize. This one is real. You wake to the utter ugliness of your reality. It is too much, too awful. What is the last thing you remember? God, it wasn't even midnight before the madness set in. You look at your hands. A tiny vibration runs through the fingers. Your entire mind feels like the raw, meaty patch that is left after a fingernail is torn off. How many hours were you blacked out? 3? 4? You sit up and look around for evidence of mischief. Smashed plates, bags of takeout food, a nightstand drawer filled with vomit. All clear. You feel your face for bruises. Nothing major. Wallet and phone? Present and accounted for. Your phone says it's 2 p.m. Not bad. You check the calls and texts. Nothing unusual. No 2-hour conversation with your boss starting at 5 a.m. You log in your bank website and take a look. $94.56 spent last night. A king's ransom by your standards, but at least you didn't go the full $400 blowout. You sit and wonder why you have this feeling of black guilt in your stomach. It's just the hangover, right? Just your poor brain snapping back from all the depressant you gave it last night, entering a hyper-vigilant state, a paranoid state, an intolerable state. God, you need a drink. You deserve a drink for not blowing the rent last night. Medically, you need a drink. Just a little drink, but nothing overboard that will get you all drunk at 3 in the afternoon and blacked out again tonight. You go out of your tiny bedroom to the front part of your apartment, and your heart stops. A woman is lying asleep on your couch. Not a young woman, an old woman. A tiny old grandma with messy gray hair. Jesus, what have you done? Her eyes slowly open. At least she's alive. She asks if you're okay now. You nod. The question is sinister. Okay now? What had been going on before? You can't deal with this without a drink. Who gives a shit if she sees, this old lady in sweatpants? You go to the freezer and get the vodka and take in 2 good belts. Your stomach makes a violent protest, but your brain almost weeps with relief. Who are you? You ask the woman directly. She smiles and lets out a shy, grandmotherly little chuckle. She says she didn't expect you to remember last night, that you had, repeatedly, warned her that you wouldn't. Her demeanor is so warm and kind, you begin to worry that you have fucked this woman, that you have fucked this elderly woman, and now she's in love with you, and wants to move her Posturepedic bed into your apartment. You ask her, with greater urgency, who she is, and you tip another shot into your mouth. She says that she wants to hear the end of your story. She says that last night you came into the cafe that she owns, carrying a bottle of wine. Before she could tell you to leave, you began telling a story, a wonderful story, but you got too drunk and didn't finish it. So she got you into a cab and made sure you got home and slept on the couch because she very much wants to hear the end of your story. You tell her that you don't recall telling any story. She expects this. She says that it's the story about the children in the forest. You know it. It was too wonderful to have just been made up. You shrug. You don't know any stories about any children in the forest. Unless it's Hansel and Gretel. Was it Hansel and Gretel? It was not. Well, that's the only child forest story you know. She tells you that it was a very beautiful story, and it made her cry, and she very much wants to know the end of it. Your mind churns through the possibilities. This woman is crazy. She is about to ask for money. She's going to rob you. She wants to get your information so she can have you arrested. The cops are already on their way, and she's stalling. But the pleading look in her eyes is quite convincing. She does just want to hear the story. The vodka is starting to loosen the paranoia's grip. You take another sip. How many drinks was that? 2? Okay, don't want to get drunk too early. No more drinking for the next hour. You take another sip. If you can't drink for the next hour, you'll need that last sip. You sit down on the couch next to her. The sweet relief of the vodka is melting away some of your anxiety, and you let out a big sigh. You ask her to tell you some of the story. Maybe it will jog your memory. She insists that she can't tell it as good as you told it, but you brush her protest aside. She begins to tell you the story. In her warm, grandmotherly voice, she begins to tell you about the magical children who lived in the forest, who danced and sang and never died, who fought bravely against the nightmare forces of the ancient queen. It really is a beautiful story, and the woman tells it so well, with lots of nice little touches that make you giggle softly. You see in your mind for a moment the sunlight through the fluttering leaves, and smell the apple-scented air, so much sweeter and freer than anything your tiny grim shithole apartment full of empty bottles. And once again your eyes grow damp. You have heard from various people at various times the beginning of this story, but you have never heard the end. Perhaps it has none.